Hey y'all, welcome back. Today I'm venturing outside my comfort zone as I dip my toe into archaeology. That's right, don your pith helmet, and let's go. Damn, that was quick. What have we got here? Jiminy Christmas! It's the United States Electoral College. Get it? 'Cause like a fossil, it's old and, whatever. Just cut to the title card. The Electoral College is often heralded as a grand success of the American experiment. They say it does all these wonderful things, like give everyone a voice, prevent voter fraud, and it makes Jesus. I'm not quite close enough to the big man upstairs to confirm or deny if Jesus jacks it to the EC, but what I can tell you is that the Electoral College doesn't really do what people say it does, or at least it doesn't directly cause the few things folks do like about it, and even if you do like those things, there's some nasty side effects and it gets complicated, bear with me here. In this video, I'm going to explore the Electoral College's history, why people say we need it, poke some holes in their defense of it, and then I'm going to look at some communities silenced by it. I also wanted to quickly add that while videos on this subject normally take the form of a debate between democracy and a republic, I'm not really here to argue either position. I'm here to demonstrate that even if you like the idea of a republic, the Electoral College is a failing institution. So without further ado, let's dig a little deeper. Fuck, cut that guard. Who keeps writing these jokes? Part 1. Hamilton left us helpless. During the Constitutional Convention of 1787, plans for how to choose a leader varied. Some proposals had Congress electing a president, or electing individuals to exclusively choose presidents, and some folks even wanted to make a prince from Prussia our king, which is a bit odd, considering that's supposedly why we just fought a war. The system that won out had it so that electors are selected to cast votes on behalf of the people, but that they only be chosen for this duty very close to the election. In Federalist Paper 68, Alexander Hamilton argues that by selecting electors right before the election and not having them be salaried government officials, we avoid them being easily corrupted by foreign interests. And the reason for them to cast their votes on behalf of their constituents was to empower the voice of regular Joes. Actually, at the time, it was to exclusively empower white male property-owning Joes, but whatever. In Federalist Paper 39, James Madison argues that republics often fall victim to greedy political elites, and says the way to avoid such corruption is to place the power in the hands of people. It is essential to such a government that it be derived from the great body of the people, not from an inconsiderable proportion or a favored class of it. But despite loving the will of the people, the Electoral College and other parts of the government kept people from having full control. Now why is that? In Hamilton's Federalist Paper 68, he says, "A small number of persons, selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass, will be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to such complicated investigations." By possesses the discernment requisite, he's essentially saying that citizens don't know enough to select the right candidate, and that a well-read politician might need to step in. And while I think that's really uncharitable to the common person's ability to suss out which president properly represents their interests, I can understand the argument that citizens, who were gatekept from political literacy, might have picked an unfit candidate. But now it's the internet age, baby! These days, you can learn the ins and outs of political procedures and topics on websites like Skillshare, who just so happens to be the sponsor of today's video. Oh, imagine me having a sponsor. But as the means of becoming politically literate have become more accessible, albeit still somewhat gatekept, the Electoral College still remains. So if this initially relevant purpose is now irrelevant, why are we still using the Electoral College? Part 2. Why folks argue we still need it. In Federalist Paper 10, James Madison writes about how dangerous factions can be to fair governance. Measures are too often decided not according to the rules and the rights of the minority party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. This is the part of the Electoral College that conservatives hold up as the reason to preserve the system, that it protects the interests of the minority in its structure and how it allocates votes across the country. In terms of overbearing majorities, our country has historically been divided by urban versus rural interests. So Electoral College stands argue that a presidential election based on popular votes would only focus on major population centers and their particular interests. So stands of the Electoral College argue it saves our country from the mob rule of the city-dwelling majority. Folks also argue that it helps prevent voter fraud. They argue that states change alignment over the years. So if you want to falsify votes in a specific state, you can't be sure your fake votes are going to go to a swing state. Whereas with a popular vote system, any fraudulent vote in any part of the country would impact an election. In general, these are the main defenses provided. I've seen a few more, like how it does a good job at upholding the two-party system, but that's rubbish, 1, and 2, a topic for a different video. If it feels like I'm summarizing the examples I gave a bit much, it's because I am. I try to make these videos as short as possible, so I gotta chop shit out somewhere. So if you aren't familiar with their talking points, I'd be sure to check out some I have linked down below. And as far as their arguments go, I can see why some of them are appealing. I just think, for me personally, the problems with the Electoral College come in the teeny-weeny fact that it doesn't actually do anything it purports to do. Part 3. Quick question. I have a question that I'm curious to hear responses to in the comments. The founders feared majority rule and set the system up accordingly. And when the Electoral College has stepped in and gone against the popular vote, it is declared that the system is properly protecting against majority rule. But my question is, why is the system declared functional when the interests of 49% are protected, but is also declared functional when the interests of 40% are neglected? The 39% of folks who voted against Nixon were much more of an overshadowed minority than the 48% of people who voted for George Bush in 2000. Where's the line between a minority party that needs to be defended and one that needs to submit to the majority? Because to me, when I hear the phrase protects minority voices, it sounds like a system that would still empower the minority even if it was down a few points nationally. So I fail to see how great its reach really is at empowering minority positions. That being said, let's get to the debunking. Part 4. Where they're wrong. Let's start with the most common defense of the Electoral College, that it brings the election out of the big cities. People bring up various big cities and say that their interests would, on their own, dictate elections. And while I can see how that argument sounds right, it isn't mathematically possible. If you add the projected populations of the 100 biggest cities in the US, you get roughly 64 million people, which is about enough votes to win an election with our current piss-poor voter turnout. Though in several elections that wouldn't have been enough. But aside from that, there are quite a few holes in the assertion that this is some sort of uniquely sized coalition, or that the group is in any way homogeneous. First off, the population of these big cities is barely more than the 60 million people who reside in rural areas. So with comparably sized populations, these two groups would have about equal influence over an election. Also, on the list of 100 cities, you'll see that in order to reach 64 million, you have to appeal to 34 states, with each city and state having unique agendas. While big cities generally trend liberal, plenty of cities are conservative. A 2014 meta-analysis of polls from big cities found that about a dozen out of 51 cities rank firmly conservative, and it turns out all of them are of the 100 biggest cities needed to reach 64 million. So in the theoretical presidential run that only focuses on the populated cities, it would necessitate appealing to their interests as well. What you would also find on such a theoretical journey is that, believe it or not, even liberally leaning cities have diverse opinions. Plenty of big cities like Pittsburgh, Milwaukee, and Houston have sizable conservative populations. So if a theoretical campaign counts on every vote from every big city for their victory model, they'd have to appeal to a bunch of conservatives. Not only that, but the focus on population centers model would end up visiting more states than the candidates visited in the 2016 election, with 34 as opposed to 30. So the popular vote model is actually prioritizing a number of regional voices that the Electoral College neglects. However, I'm sure someone would protest that such a model, while appealing to a variety of political opinions, still focuses on the desires of urban citizens, and therefore the Electoral College still has a purpose in amplifying the voices of rural areas. But you see, the Electoral College isn't actually doing that amplification. These days, both parties have a few small states in their coalition, and a number end up being swing states, so it feels like the system's propping them up, but that's purely coincidental. It's possible to win the Electoral College with just 11 states. And in said fantasy world, it's possible to win the biggest states by a 0.2% margin, lose the other 40 by an 8-point margin, and in the process lose the popular vote but win the Electoral College. So even when 40 states generally vote against one candidate, and the other 11 states are lost with tight margins, the Electoral College has no answers. It would instead empower and legitimize the overbearing interests of said 11 big states. I bring this up to point out that the reason a state with 4 electoral votes, like New Hampshire, gets a lot of attention has nothing to do with a system that prioritizes small states. The Electoral College could care less if a state is big, small, or medium. It functionally only cares about swing states, and when bigger slices of swing state pie pop up, those become the focus, evidenced by the fact that Ohio and Florida routinely get the most attention out of any state. To support my claim, let's turn to this lovely little graphic that shows campaign stops in 2016, the best data we have for which populations are getting prioritized. In it, you'll see that 2/3 of every campaign event took place in 6 states, which is as narrow a focus as folks will claim the popular vote would bring about. Also, 24 states didn't see any campaign stops. That's 48% of the states. Plus, a lot of the states that get the most attention are pretty big, while the ones neglected are pretty small. Florida is one of the most populous states, yet it gets constant attention while much of its less populated neighbors get ignored. But wait. I thought the system was supposed to take focus away from big states and give it to the smaller ones. Well, a lot of the smaller states are considered shoo-ins for either party, and therefore not worth reaching out to. So although folks will say the Electoral College prioritizes small states, in reality candidates only care about reaching out to voters in the few states that swing frequently, while failing to prioritize the interests of about half the union. Speaking of swing states, while political landscapes do change, we can generally eliminate a supermajority of states from swing status. 38 states haven't flipped since 2000, and another 7 states have only flipped once since then. So picking which states to commit voter fraud in are easier than some make it out to be. Lastly, I want to debunk the idea that abolishing the Electoral College would exclusively benefit Democrats. It's true that the current makeup of our country gives Republicans an edge, since they have enough small states in their coalition to just kind of coast. But the Electoral College can screw over any coalition. An often neglected election makes that clear. In 2004, Bush almost lost the election in a way nearly identical to the way Hillary Clinton lost. If merely 60,000 folks in Ohio, or if about 58,000 folks between Colorado, Iowa, and New Mexico voted for Kerry instead of Bush, Kerry would have won the Electoral College despite losing the popular vote by about 3 million. And that potential subversion of democracy is unacceptable, no matter which of these two war criminals you tend to favor. And yes, I know, if were a fifth, we'd all be tipsy. But if the shoe had ever manifested onto the other foot, I suspect conservatives might have a vastly different opinion on the Electoral College, evidenced by the fact that when it looked like Mitt Romney might win the popular vote but lose the Electoral College, a very specific conservative argued for its abolition. So that about sums up my counter-arguments. However, I recognize that some folks might not be satisfied with my debunking so far, likely because they believe that, regardless of its clear and demonstrable faults, the Electoral College still ultimately uplifts voices. Who cares if most of the swing states are pretty big, they might say. The fact that a few of them are rather small is proof that the system's working. So for anyone out there who thinks that every point I've made so far is fine, because to them, ultimately the Electoral College uplifts voices, allow me to show you the ways that the Electoral College doesn't uplift voices, and in some cases, actively silences them. Part 5. The folks left behind. This isn't its only institutional barrier, but third parties struggle under the Electoral College. Since slim margins are the difference between 0 and up to 29 votes for either of the big parties, third parties are vilified as a wasted vote for the candidate adjacent to one's politics. A popular vote system would help citizens vote how they want, whereas the Electoral College empowers the lesser of two evils argument that plagues our elections. Moving off of third parties and onto the two parties for a second. Washington State has voted blue since the 80s, but in the 2016 election, over 1 million Washington residents voted for Trump. Under the current system, those 1.2 million people were unable to impact the election. We see the same in California and New York, where 6.5 million voters had no impact on electing President Trump. And between Texas, Pennsylvania, and Florida, almost 11 million votes for Hillary Clinton were rendered useless. Under the Electoral College, every vote that doesn't fit the statewide majority is irrelevant. And on the whole, about 53 million people, or 42.5% of folks who voted red or blue, saw their voices have no impact on the election. Despite claiming to protect dissenting voices, the Electoral College utterly fails at making every vote count on a statewide level. And to bring the macro down to the micro, many folks who voted for Trump in blue states like California did so based off policies they saw as preferable for farmers. Though they got their guy in the end, they had no impact on electing Trump. They had to just sit there and hope that the other states carried their candidate to victory. Another example, Hispanic voters in Texas got silenced. Given Trump's racist and xenophobic platform, many Hispanic folks thought it in their best interest to vote for a candidate that didn't want to deport their loved ones and didn't frame people who looked like them migrating into the US as dangerous. Or at least the candidate who wasn't proudly xenophobic. Clinton wasn't great on immigration. Comparing these two maps, we can see that the counties that voted blue in 2016 are generally the districts with large Hispanic populations. But under the Electoral College, the interests of this literal oppressed minority weren't met. Similarly, the voices of indigenous peoples are often silenced by the Electoral College. While each indigenous tribe and nation are ideologically diverse, they generally vote blue. Problem is, the largest concentrations of indigenous peoples are in solid red states, so their votes often have no impact on an election. And the trouble indigenous peoples encounter brings to light a sneaky way the Electoral College silences voices. It's not just that their vote in a red state doesn't count, but that because they're in a solid red state, the opposition party's platforms aren't incentivized to appeal to them. With a popular vote, there's incentive to increase voter turnout with any demographic in any state. Having policies to entice indigenous peoples could be part of a winning coalition for Democrats. But because so many of them live in solid red states, the Electoral College is essentially making it a waste of political capital to appeal to them. So their voices aren't being heard by the current system. Many communities like these are rendered irrelevant in a presidential election unless they align with the majority. But what's just as bad as this near voter suppression is the Electoral College's impact on voter depression, aka citizens feeling so powerless they don't even bother to vote. Looking at recent elections, we see that battleground states generally drive voter turnout, but that the opposite is also true. States with solid electoral bases depress voter turnout. It seems to be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because California always votes blue, citizens, according to the data, just don't show up to change that notion. And outside the macro data, I know plenty of people in non-swing states who feel disheartened by the fact that their dissenting voices don't count. The idea that the Electoral College makes every vote count is absurd. It clearly suppresses and depresses voices in a variety of ways. Part 6. One final question. We often talk about the Electoral College in terms of generic parties and nameless coalitions. By talking in these terms, we buy into a presumption that the Founding Fathers set up the system with zero ideological tendencies in mind, that any generic minority coalition could benefit from such a system. But rather than further gobble up this presumption with no questions asked, I would like to pose a question. Is it possible that the founders set up the system to protect a specific demographic? That maybe, just maybe, the same founders who made it so that citizens could not elect senators and who only let property-owning white men vote, perhaps made those decisions and structured the Electoral College the way they did to protect the self-interests of the haves from the desires of the have-nots, that maybe the founders had a feeling common people would vote in their own rational self-interest directly in opposition to the interests of the haves, and that safeguards were thus needed to limit the voice of the common person. I'll leave you to decide on that one. Part 7. What do we do now? So far, we've looked at the history of the Electoral College, we've debunked defenses for its existence, and we've looked at numerous communities silenced under its weight. And up until this point, I feel pretty confident about my stance. But when it comes to how to fix it, I'm not sure what's the best solution. There's a fully democratic election, as in we use the popular vote. We do this for every other elected office, so this shouldn't be that fucking big of a deal. But what do I know? I'm just a lib-cucked cartoon. And then there's the proportional system, where electoral votes are split up instead of given to one candidate. This sounds like a good compromise to a lot of folks, but the potential, or I should say likelihood, of a state-to-state variance of how votes are allocated makes it hard to tell if this would properly represent the will of the people. But in my opinion, either of these would be an improvement, if for no other reason than increasing voter turnout. And while opinions on the Electoral College break on partisan grounds, even some Republican pundits have voiced concerns.
The problem I have with the Electoral College is the same problem everybody else has with the Electoral College, which is I don't understand why my vote in California should mean nothing, but a vote in another state means more. And that seems to me bizarre.
And I totally agree with them. Whoa. Never thought those words would leave my mouth. Looking at some polls, most Americans want to elect presidents based off the popular vote. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's because a lot of them experience the same injustices I've outlined. And no matter how much propaganda Republicans pump out, the American public knows what I've demonstrated in this video. That the Electoral College is a sham. That'll be it for this video, everyone. If you enjoyed it, be sure to toss me one of them likes and subscribe down below, ringing that little bell so you can know the exact nanosecond I release my next video. Thanks much, and I'll see you next time.